All right, y'all, here we go. This is chapter 10 in your book, Multicultural Students with Special Language Needs, Practical Strategies for Assessment and Intervention, 5th edition by Dr. Celeste Roseberry-McKibbin. So this is part 1, may have already said that. We're going to talk about bilingualism and second language learning. All right, y'all, here we go. So we're going to talk about all 6 of these processes. So your book details these 6 processes that are involved in second language acquisition. And we're going to talk about it in the frame of learning English as a second language. All right, so here we go. So the first thing we're going to talk about is transfer. So transfer is when you have a communicative behavior that is really kind of entrenched in your first language, and you carry it over into the second language that you're learning. So, and that can be things like morphemes, like ing morpheme, plurals, possessives, things like that. Syntax, phonology. I think phonology is one of those things that you definitely hear a lot of transfer in folks who are learning English out of childhood, either in later childhood as teenagers or really past the age of 9 at a maximum. So it's also referred to as cross-linguistic influence, and so you might have somebody who doesn't have the variety of vowels that are present in English. So I remember my dad was career Navy. At one point we were stationed in Key West, Florida. There were lots of Cuban Americans there, and so lots of folks who spoke Spanish as their primary language. And so the I vowel sometimes would become the E. So our bus driver was taking us home from school one afternoon when I was in 4th grade, and the back emergency door popped open, and all of a sudden, his name was Eddie, all of a sudden Eddie stops the bus and goes, "Son of beat sheet." So there you go, a little linguistic transfer. So the more limited your experience with the particular language is, the more likely you are to have a transfer effect of between grammar and syntax and whatever in every aspect of language. So the second thing that may happen is called fossilization. So it is when some aspect of your first language becomes kind of permanently entrenched in your second language, despite an overall proficiency in your second language. So the example in the book is she talks about a fluent English speaking Cuban American who habitually said the news are that instead of the news is. She talks about another example of where somebody says my foots are sore because of the irregular plurality of feet. So all kinds of different things. Irregular past tense definitely messes up folks. The irregular verbs, the exceptions to any English rule, mess us all up. So think about the aspects, if you are a primary English speaker, think about the aspects of English that tend to mess us up as children, as writers, even as native speakers, and amplify that out, oh, I don't know, 5 to 10-fold. And those are the challenges that people who are trying to acquire English as a second language may be facing. All right. The third thing that may happen, and I'm not as convinced about this one. So as a speech language pathologist, I want you to really think about this. And I don't know, I would be really cautious about this, especially in really young children. So kind of the green box there says the younger the child when exposure to language 2 occurs, the longer the silent period can last. I would really encourage you to be cautious about that. You don't want to miss a potential language disorder or developmental language disorder because you have a child who is acquiring more than one language. A lot of folks used to tell people learning or language or learning English as a second language that they should stop talking to their children in the primary language. That is absolutely not a thing. Do not do that. Do not tell people that they should quit using their primary language with their children. I don't care what identified disability may be going on. The damage you do to the family system is way greater than any perceived deficit you are encouraging in a child who is already experiencing a deficit. So anyway, the idea is, though, that some folks go through a period where they are listening more than they're talking. So again, I know in my limited Spanish proficiency, I do have a tendency to listen more than talk because I understand more than I can express. But again, I just really encourage you to exercise caution about this. It is much better to investigate and ensure that the child is not experiencing a more widely pervasive language disorder than to just assume that they're going through or developmental disorder, or rather than assume that they're just going through this silent period. All right, so another thing that can happen in English language learning is what's called interlanguage. And this is kind of the in-between period where you have some expressive language skill, but you're not really you're definitely not fluent. So it's again, it starts when you start using this time period of interlanguage is defined as when the learner starts to use language productively until you reach fluency or competence that's similar to a native speaker. One of the things that does happen is that as we learn languages, whether we're learning them formally or informally through immersion, we kind of figure out our own rules as to how things work. And then as we become more proficient or more educated, formally educated in the language and its use, we uh, edit those rules so that they become more and more congruent with the actual language. So in this interlanguage period, our errors are usually inconsistent, the same kinds of things that we usually see in young children as they are learning a primary language or multiple languages at once. So, you will make an error here, but then you'll hit it there and you'll get it right in some other context. And that's just not uncommon. That is kind of the road we all take towards proficiency with most skills. Right, so the fifth thing is called language loss. So one of the things that, again, as speech language pathologists, as humans out in the world, we really need to encourage people to hold on to their primary languages as best as they can. So in this group of four things, um, one of the things that can happen if we start at the top left in kind of the lighter orange square, it says that if the use of your primary language, like language one, so in this case, let's go Tagalog to English. So we have someone who is a primary Tagalog speaker and is learning English. So as they use Tagalog less and less, and they lose those skills and their proficiency in English increases. So moving down, let's go left to right. So going to the right, where it says younger students are particularly at risk of losing their primary language if they're only speaking English at school. That's something we really need to be mindful of, because again, you don't want to you don't want folks to lose their primary language, because that is the best recipe for acculturalization. And we want individuals to be able to maintain their base culture and be successful in an English only. I guess I dropped in and dropped out of this. I'm not entirely sure what happened with that. So that's interesting. And it dropped my screen share. So let's pick that back up. All right, I guess I will check this recording later to see how much of it we may have lost or not lost. So I'm going to go ahead and just repeat what I was saying about, I'm going to go ahead and grab my pointer here. Um, we are here talking about minority languages, and that what makes something a minority language is that very few people speak it. So if you are transplanted from a community of where your dialect is not widely spoken anyway, to the US, where your dialect is probably only spoken by your family, chances are you're going to lose your dialect and your proficiency even more quickly than if you spoke a non-minority language. So let's use Spanish like as a base language. There are many Spanish-speaking individuals in the US, but let's say that you speak also, so you speak mainstream Spanish, but you also speak minority dialect from where you used to live. You may hold on to your mainstream Spanish as you learn English, but you're likely to lose the minority dialect because you're not around other people who are speaking it. All right. So one of the things that can happen is, let's say that the student is losing their primary language. So again, let's say it was a minority dialect, that was their primary language, and they're losing that, and they are not proficient in English as of yet, then it may look like they're actually struggling in both languages. And that's one of the things where you really have to consider whether what you're seeing is a hallmark of language disorder versus a lack of exposure to both languages. So you've lost exposure to language one, and you have limited exposure to English as your language two. So really, it's not that you are having difficulty learning language, which is kind of the definition of a language disorder. It's that really you just don't have enough exposure in either language to be proficient. So that leads us to our sixth point, which is talking about code switching. So code switching is when you can seamlessly move between one language and another language. We do this with dialects all the time. We do this with our vocabulary based on who we're talking to, and you can do it actually language to language. Code switching is not confusing to people. It is something that we do. It does not confuse the child's usage of language. In the early stages of learning the second language, and in this case we're saying English, your student or the learner may substitute, and this is what we talked about before with like as you're in that interlanguage period, starting with production, but you're not yet to fluency or proficiency, you will have a lot of transfer. And that's what this is in the early stages, your transfer is going to be a lot more prevalent because you're drawing on the structures that you already know to try to apply them to the language that you're learning. And kids code switch more in some situations than in others, and you just need to be sensitive to that. All right, so the next part of the chapter actually talks about the affective variables or the emotional variables that can influence someone's ability to acquire a second language. And one of them is, so there are three that your book talks about. with the first being motivation, and then your personality or temperament, and overall anxiety levels. So this is one of my favorite uh, representations of emotion vocabulary, and it is the circumplex model of arousal. And what it's really talking about is, or trying to show, is that on the x-axis we have what's called valence, which is between negative and positive. So is what we're feeling perceived as being a positive emotion or as a negative emotion? And then on the y-axis, you have the intensity with which you're feeling that particular valence. So over here, you have a high negative affect. So you are very intensely feeling negative. One of the things about that, or words that may go with that, are jittery or nervous, whereas physiologically, if you're over on the other side where you're having a high physiological arousal, as in your heart's pounding and maybe your hands are sweating, we will frame it with the words like, I don't think I'd ever use the word peppy, but whatever, enthusiastic or excited. So really, physiologically, when you get on the arousal scale or the intensity scale, physiologically, the same things are at work, whether you're experiencing it as a negative feeling or a positive feeling. The difference is the words we use. So the difference between being sleepy and being tired is whether you're kind of in this content, which is what I think this is supposed to say, content space versus a discontent, like, or just a feeling negatively worn out versus feeling like you could just happily doze off. So anyway, this is one of my, like I said, this is one of my favorite representations of vocabulary associated with emotion. And as speech language pathologists, this is one of the things we should really pay attention to as we are helping folks learn language, and as we, whether it is English as a second language, or whether we are practicing habilitation with helping folks who are experiencing language disorders acquire language. Emotion words count. The way we frame our worlds and the way we experience our worlds and the way we experience our physical states is very language driven. All right, so in terms of the variables that can affect language acquisition, we're going to talk about motivation first. So there are a lot of different things that affect how motivated a student may be to learn, or a person may be to learn another language. One of them is acculturation. So acculturation is talked about in detail in your book. It's really well defined. But acculturation can go in two different ways. It may be that the person is not motivated to learn a new language because they don't want to lose the culture that they came from. On the flip side, depending on the other variables at work, a person may be very interested in acculturation. They may be very anxious to leave behind the culture that they came from. This actually was very prevalent in Jewish people, Eastern European Jewish people fleeing Europe during World War II and just following World War II. Because remember, the reasons that you end up in another country matter, whether you are fleeing as a refugee or whether you are making an intentional decision to come in as an immigrant. So, and that may affect your perception of acculturation, and your motivation. Okay, another possibility is what's called enclosure. So, like I said, when I was growing up, we lived in Key West for a time, and Florida has a high density of Cuban American folks. And so there is a reasonable degree of enclosure there. So that means that there are communities of Cuban Americans kind of packed together so that the, excuse me, sorry, pollen season for sure. So that folks can maintain their culture and be able to share that culture in all kinds of different ways, in schools and churches and recreational activities, things like that. So if, let's say, you are transplanted, so let's say, again, you are that Guatemalan individual that has been sponsored by a family living in Menominee, Wisconsin. So the odds of you, unless you get lucky, and there are a bunch of families in Menominee, Wisconsin sponsoring Guatemalan families from your particular area, you will likely not have any degree of enclosure. Pardon me. All right, so another idea is called congruence, and it is how accepted your cultural group is by the dominant group. So if you are, let's say, so let's say, back to being a Guatemalan person transplanted into the rural Midwest, you may not have a lot of congruence with the dominant culture. Because the similarities between where you grew up and a equatorial country versus a northern latitude part of the United States, you will likely not have a lot of cultural similarity or shared experience. And so that may be an incongruence. All right, so the next thing that your book talks about is the attitudes of the English language learners student group and your dominant group toward one another, which also plays into congruence. So if you come in, and this happened a lot and still happens, but the examples that come to mind are Chinese immigrants to California and the rest of the US during the gold rush. The attitude of, not surprisingly, of the white colonizer people who were already here towards the Chinese people was really crappy. And Chinese people were treated as subhumans. And that is definitely a theme that is pretty pervasive, not just in the US, but we have a particular gift for it. So attitudes matter, and they can influence the person's motivation to um, learn English and learn the language, which again comes back to this acculturation piece as well. So these things are not separate entities. They are all really deeply entwined. One feeds into the next, which is why they're all under the umbrella of motivation. So another thing that may influence motivation is this a temporary move? Like, are you the spouse of someone who is here for training purposes? When I was in college, I dated a man whose family was Dutch. And his dad was stationed in the US as part of NATO. So they knew it wasn't going to be a particularly permanent move. It turned out to be a really, they were here for many years because they stayed after he retired. But that makes a big difference. If I know that, let's say that I'm a military spouse and um, we're being stationed in Germany, and I know we're only going to be there for 2 years. My motivation to learn German to the level of proficiency is not going to be as high as if I decide to move to Germany and make it my permanent residence. Um, and again, coming back to acculturation, does the student think that learning English is going to change who they are? Does it mean that they are no longer a Guatemalan American or a Dutch American or a Chinese American, etc.? And what led them to leave their country of origin? Again, was it traumatic, or was it a result, like a choice to immigrate? Like, again, the difference between being a refugee and being an immigrant, the difference in choice to go to a different country and establish a new life. So all of these things make a big difference in how motivated, either to be very motivated to learn or not motivated to learn the language. So another big factor that you absolutely can't rule out is personality. So we all come into so temperament is how you come wired into the world, uh, how reactive you are to your sensory stimuli, and how regulated you are, how well you can control your reactions to sensory stimuli. Personality is shaped by temperament, but it's also shaped by the effects of our experience. So that's where self-esteem comes into play. So you need to have a really positive self-concept and a positive attitude when it comes to learning language. If you feel like there's no way you're ever going to get it and people are going to make fun of you and you're just dumb, then your ability to easily acquire any skill is going to be limited. But language proficiency in particular really requires engaging with the language. Remember that a lot of it is exposure, and language learning is very much a use it or lose it sort of skill. So extroversion also plays into that. The more extroverted you are, the more likely you are to engage with, take chances, using your language, and engaging in conversation with other people. So if you're introverted by nature, you are not going to be as motivated to try to strike up conversations with people anyway. So you're not going to pick up those skills as quickly because you really are not particularly motivated to use them anyway. And then assertiveness. So assertiveness is also helpful because assertive learners will take advantage of all the different opportunities to use their language. Um, so I was walking in First Landing State Park, and I was going down the trail, and there was a group of kids in front of me well, I passed the group of adults first, and they were speaking French. At least I think it was French. It definitely wasn't Spanish because I would have recognized that. It sounded like French just because of the prosody and phonemes being used. At least to me. So I passed the adults, and then I came upon a group of kids, and they were chatting together in French. And as I passed, I said, "Excuse me," and then one of the older boys said, "Have a good day," or something, or "How are you? Have a good day." And that's really an assertiveness, is he took an opportunity to use English with a native English speaker, because I had spoken to him in English. And so by taking advantage of that opportunity, he took advantage of an opportunity to learn and use. And that is very much a necessity when it comes to language learning. All right, so kind of the third aspect, affective aspect of that can contribute to your ability to learn another language is your anxiety level. This just makes complete sense, period. So here we are. As I'm recording this, we're in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. There is a lot of anxiety in the world for so many reasons, and it makes it harder to learn. And so as students trying to muscle your way through classes to the end of the semester, any levels of anxiety just make it harder to take in information and retrieve information. So this is definitely true with language learning as well. So if you're in a state of lower anxiety, it is easier to learn, it's easier to benefit from language input. And one of the interesting things, like what I kind of visualize, like when I think about anxiety and I think about this idea of mental block, is your um, experience kind of radiates its way from your brainstem up to the higher levels of your cerebrum, of your cortex in your brain. So kind of what I picture sometimes is when you are at a particularly high level of anxiety, like I picture it almost like when you see in movies when submarines are about to submerge and they batten down the hatches. They close the things and they close the hatches, and they tamp them down, with the looks like a steering wheel. I'm super articulate today. Sorry about that. But anyway, I think about that like as a mental block, that the anxiety actually battens down the hatches and keeps information really from being able to get to your working memory, and then consequently to your long-term memory. And it makes it harder for it to come in the other direction too, because the anxiety and the neurotransmitters that you're being washed in from the anxiety keep you from being able to efficiently process information. All right, and that's where any kind of good breathing technique, self-care, all of those kinds of things are going to help you as learners. All right, so now we're going to switch gears a little bit from sort of what um, the affective or the feelings part of language acquisition, second language acquisition, to talking about learning styles. So we're going to talk about 4 different learning styles, and that will finish out this particular set of slides. So the first learning style we're going to talk about is called modeling. So this is when you are going to, so one of the things, uh, group of folks that have had an opportunity to get to know. One of the folks grew up in Georgia and learned to speak Spanish in Georgia. So he would describe himself as sounding like a redneck when he tries to speak Spanish because he has a southern dialect of Spanish, which comes to kind of bullet number 1, where you may end up with a pattern that's similar to a pattern of speaking English that's similar to those that are used by your parents and other family members or the person that you are learning English from. Okay, so the more people, and this is what bullet number 2 is trying to get you to think about, is the more people you spend time with who are native speakers of that language, they will help, not help, but they will influence too how much closer to native sounding fluency, not fluency, native sounding proficiency, I guess, you can get to. But the more time you spend with other uh, English language learners, the more likely you are to maintain the characteristics of those folks too, which is not the end of the world. It's just something to consider. All right, so one of the things that uh, also is certainly at work is avoidance. Again, I know for me, as someone who is only marginally proficient in spoken Spanish, I will avoid using it because I don't want to be embarrassed, and which is kind of a silly thing. Actually, it's not kind of a silly thing, it's a super silly thing, because we've just talked about all of the reasons why using it is important, and why people who are more assertive and self-confident tend to learn faster. So the more a student avoids using English, and the more ridicule that they experience, the harder everything is. Again, circle back to anxiety. Um, Students who have very pronounced accents are more likely to avoid because it is harder for them to be understood, and people suck, so they're more likely to be ridiculed. All right, so this leads us to the third thing, which is practice opportunities. And so this is something that I think we have, or I have tried to weave throughout this topic. Is it's about exposure, that having opportunities to practice your second language and and use it is crucial to getting through the interlanguage period to proficiency. If you only use your second language at school or every third Friday night in a group of people who speak Spanish or English or whatever, the longer it's going to take you to achieve proficiency. So really trying to encourage safe spaces for folks to practice their English is important. All right, so one of the other things that is really helpful, and I worked at a Macaroni Grill in Birmingham, Alabama, what feels like a million years ago, and the guys who washed the dishes were Hispanic, and so I would try to use some of my Spanish on them, and they would try to use some of their English, and our conversations were pretty much always the same. I don't even remember what they are anymore, but they were really probably consisted of perhaps these three sort of phrases that we would swap in each other's language. So formulaic language, things like how are you, thank you, you're welcome, have a good day, good morning, all of those kinds of things are phrases that we learn that we don't tend to learn as individual words. We learn them as word chunks, and they help us sound like we're more proficient in a language than we actually are. And it's what we use to maintain a very simple conversation. Again, this is what my Hispanic coworkers and I used on each other all the time to try to become more proficient in each other's languages. Unfortunately, we didn't get very far. We just kind of stuck in our rut and had the same conversations over and over again. So there you go. One of the things, though, is depending on what phrase of formulaic language you have, people may assume you're more proficient in that language than you actually are. So if you have like a more obscure phrase that you can bust into conversation, folks may think that you actually are better, again, more proficient than you've actually managed to achieve. All right, so that's it for this group of slides, and I hope you're out there and you're making good choices. I look forward to sharing the next one with you. See ya.